The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, my name is Bruce Southworth. I'm the president of the Norwegian Explorers, a local Sherlockian group, and we're having a discussion today with Mark McPherson. Mark has been described as a real-life Indiana Jones, a literary sleuth, parapsychologist, a scholar-adventurer. In 1984, he founded an agency called the Daedalus Agency to investigate matters of unusual phenomena, mysteries, archaeological, historical items. His researches have taken him all over the world into various interesting investigations, the Shroud of Turin, the Loch Ness Monster, and so on. He's written, produced, and starred in a PBS documentary called The Great Shakespeare Duel. He's written a novel called The Marlowe Tryst. And he's recently added playwright and stage actor to his list of accomplishments. And he's in town today to in an upcoming performance of his show, An Evening with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Welcome, Mark. It's good to have you here.
Good to be here.
Before we get too much into Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, I wanted to find out a little bit about how you came to found the Daedalus Agency. What was the genesis of that?
Well, I've wondered about that myself, because I found something I'd written up about the time I was in junior high school, and that was a proposal for a thing called Lost Causes Incorporated. And this was predicated on my making $1 million, and I'd go looking for the Loch Ness Monster, the Abominable Snowman, I'd find the Titanic, I'd go ghost hunting, a number of things. Well, somebody pointed out to me a few years back that even though I hadn't made the $1 million, someone else had found the Titanic, but I'd done a lot of things like ghost hunting and prowling pyramids and diving and being on the surface of Loch Ness looking for the monster, digging up King Arthur's Camelot, things like this. It was, I suppose, an idea about the time a window of interest was opening up, even before Shirley MacLaine supposedly jammed it open, before the New Age consciousness was really coming. And I knew that people were always curious about a variety of subjects. And I thought, wouldn't it be an interesting formula if somebody could become knowledgeable enough and then go on site, visit the place where the thing was supposedly happening, talk to the people involved, get their hands dirty, so to speak, with the subject matter, and then come back and make a report in the form of a film or a lecture or performance art presentation, giving them everything they wanted to know about the subject. Perhaps not giving them the final answer, perhaps not giving them the solution to the mystery, but allowing them to be very well informed, and they could then make their own decision. And so I created the Daedalus Agency on that basis. I suppose it's a flattering thing for anybody to say that you remind them of Indiana Jones, whether you need a shave or not, but it's the matter that I remember when I first saw that film, the thing I liked about this character was there he was in his tweeds in his classroom, but in a wink of an eye, he could be out in the bush, dirty, doing exactly what he wanted to do, and he would then bring back the fruits of his quest. And I have always been accused of liking the notion of the quest. I agree with a British friend of mine, better the proposition of the quest, whatever it might be, than the arid notion that there's no quest at all. Because we all have quests. We all have our holy grails. And so I decided to equip myself sufficiently so that I could go into the field, investigate a number of these subjects, these mysterious topics, things of archaeological value, of psychical interest. And so we created the agency. And I suppose it was my boyhood love of mysteries and meeting Sherlock Holmes in the 60 Holmes stories, then meeting the singular people devoted to the study of Sherlock Holmes, going to the Sherlock Holmes meetings, being taken to the Baker Street Irregulars meeting in New York. And it's strange how that thing happens, because one moment you're being introduced to Rex Stout and you're 14. The next moment it seems someone is tapping you on the shoulder and they want you to meet their 14-year-old son. This progressive interest in Sherlock Holmes and mysteries. I became more fascinated as I got older in the man who created Sherlock Holmes, and that was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And I found, more coincidentally then deliberately that many of my interests had parallels to Doyle's. My interest in, say, the Loch Ness Monster question paralleled his belief that, and he wrote The Lost World about dinosaurs existing in a modern world. His penchant, his crusade for spiritualism, my interest in psychical research, his love of chivalry and the knightly days, I guess you'd call them, my interest in the Arthurian period and the truth behind the legends. All of these interests allowed me to form a plan for creating an agency. That became Daedalus. And ironically, it was when I was coming back through Britain from a lecture I'd been asked to deliver to a British audience about King Arthur, which is really, talk about a strange thing, having an American come in and talk to the British about King Arthur.
Tell them about their own
culture.
Yeah.
Well, I was introduced by way of a good friend, one of, I think, the preeminent Sherlockian alive today, John Bennett Shaw, great Sherlock Holmes collector, and he saw to it that I was able to meet Dame Jean Conan Doyle in London, the last surviving child of Sir Arthur, and we met, and I broached the concept of a unique tribute to her father, which was a play.
Was that something that you had in mind before? I've always been intrigued about that, if that was something in the back of your mind before
I dueled
meeting
with
her.
the idea, but I thought to myself, surely someone should have done this before now, but we hadn't seen it. We'd seen Doyle portrayed rather ineffectively in a couple of films. In talking with Dame Jean, two things came to light. She was not happy at all with any of the characterizations of her father. And also, she said, and would you be interested in portraying my father? And I said, well, it would be interesting. And she said, well, I've thought since you came in how much you resembled him. And it got to the point after a while where I couldn't disavow it. She would continue to remind me how much. And then, of course, when we got into the writing and the creating of the play, she worked on this project with me. And my goal was to bring as much fidelity to recreating Doyle, his voice, how he spoke, having the luxury of being with his daughter, who as a child was his sort of tryout audience, his rehearsal audience, watched him perfect his platform performances. So having the liberty to sit as I'm sitting with you and to say, how did he hold his pipe? How did he gesture? How did he do this or that? Things that, unless you were concerned with accuracy, an audience would never notice. But hopefully, I thought, apart from anyone else who might portray Doyle in my play, that if I were able to do this and be the first, I would feel as if I had done something unique, to be the first allowed to do it, to be the first to do it in tandem with his daughter, and also to have lobbied, you might say, a number of scholars, Doyleans, people who were interested in Conan Doyle, and to get their endorsements if I could.
And certainly set a precedent or a standard for anyone who would subsequently do it by getting all the motions right and the voice right. And
well, you know, Doyle was said to be able to sort of spellbind a large audience. As a speaker, he wasn't fancy, but it was the skill of his ability as a storyteller. And his ability to project his voice and both his ideas, to recreate through his writings. And so what we attempt to do in the play is to have Doyle spin his own story. And it's an interesting concept for any individual to be put into the odd situation of playing themselves. He is asked to take to the stage in a play about himself. So therefore he has to rehearse a manuscript that he has written, when, as he says in the play, ironically, the life occurred without very little rehearsal at all, and so now he must prepare. We are hoping this is a unique tribute to Doyle, as we've done it so many times, and after we do it here in the Minneapolis area, we're going to be doing it in London, where Dame Jean will be in the audience, along with a number of other people.
Has she seen it before? I know she's seen the
She
script.
has not seen the play because we have not been able to do it over there. We were going to do it a year ago, but then the war got in the way.
Oh, yeah.
But it's the idea that wherever I've gone, we've been playing before general public audiences, not with all respect to my friends who enjoy wearing the deerstalker and speak the Sherlockian language, what I call Sherlockian pursuit, this game that we all have played. But my point in doing this was to remind people that Doyle created this great game. He created Sherlock Holmes, yes, but he also created the Brigadier Gerard and Professor Challenger and Sir Nigel, so many other characters in literature.
And indeed, his nonfiction works, the Boer War, World War I. I mean, he was a very scholarly academic.
He was knighted as a result of his patriotic efforts on behalf of writing a history of the Boer War. And yet he was, it's believed, refused a peerage, which is the next distinction beyond knighthood, because of his unpopular interest in spiritualism. He believed in spiritualism at a time when, after the war, First World War, so many young men were going off and dying, and the question was, could they still exist? Well, this became a replacement for the religion that Doyle lost very early on when he was exposed to the much Catholicism, and he found as a medical materialist, he became a doctor, that these valleys of doubt were opening up. Doyle is a fascinating paradox. He is the creator of the world's greatest logical thinker, but he also was a believer in fairies and mediums and seance circles.
Did you find, working with Dame Jean and as you researched the character, which is something I'd like to ask you about as well, how you went about researching it, but I'm curious, as you get into the character and know him really well, was there anything that really surprised you about him that hadn't been kind of clear in the 13 or 14 biographies that have been done about him?
Well, one of the long-standing issues was he married, and out of that domestic tranquility created Sherlock Holmes. His wife, however, was diagnosed as having consumption or tuberculosis and spent about 13 of their 21 years of marriage as an invalid afflicted with this disease. She bore him children, and yet she was sort of immobilized. The controversial issue, the kind of thing we like to talk about our politicians today, they like to drag up scandal about famous people, but Doyle met a young woman named Jean Leckie, a beautiful young Scottish woman who was just as unusual as he was, and because he was a married man, he vowed that he was not going to fool about, he wasn't going to have an affair, wasn't going to betray his wife and children, but he had a friendship with this woman who believed in a code of honor, as did Doyle, for a decade. And at the end of that period of time, when his wife did die, he went into a great emotional sort of collapse. He became Sherlock Holmes during this period of time, pulling himself out of the doldrums, and he solved a real-life case, which led him to continue to investigate a number of other things. When he had literally put himself back from the shadows into the light, his life straightened out, and he married this good friend, Jean Leckie, who happens to be the mother of my friend Dame Jean in London now. I learned also how peculiar Conan Doyle was, because he was the sort of man who could live by, as he says in the play, a code of honor, by which a man might live. Well, we think of that as terribly old-fashioned, and it is. But particularly parents, teachers, younger people, the idea of teaching this kind of value, where do they get it? They don't get it in school.
No.
So they must get it at home, and this is where Doyle got it, and it gave him a philosophy of conduct, which made him a very valorous person. And a knight, it's true, but a knight almost in the chivalrous medieval fashion.
Yeah, that's kind of the understanding you have of the character, and it certainly fits with his epitaph. Is it blade straight, steel true? Yeah, very much in that light.
Yeah.
Your own investigations into bizarre things. I know at one point you were involved with Scotland Yard in the fairly recent, what they were calling the Yorkshire Ripper case. I'm curious if you have gotten any insight through your researchers or through Dame Jean why Doyle was relatively silent on the Jack the Ripper murder case at that time or later.
Well, the first Sherlock Holmes story, Study in Scarlet, debuted in print in 1887, which was the year before the Jack the Ripper murders, officially 5 murders, possibly more, of streetwalkers, harlots, earning the killer the title of Red Jack or Jack the Harlot Killer, Jack the Ripper. Doyle would not have been in a position of authority, or he wasn't known as the great creator, the great detective. Holmes came and went without any hoopla at all. Although it would have been interesting had the Holmes stories debuted in 1888 when people were crying out for the police to solve the Ripper murders. Even a fictional hero might have helped, and Holmes might have been shot up into a higher level of fame faster. Doyle looked at the case after the fact, examined it, investigated it. There is not still a clear-cut answer as to who exactly the Ripper was. There's some good guesswork here, but ironically, it was because they studied the, you might say, earmarks of the Yorkshire Ripper's pattern, the modern Ripper of the late 1970s. He did trip himself up by trying to emulate his Victorian namesake. And this is one of the things we were discussing. This is how I got involved with the Metropolitan Police, because a friend of mine was involved and invited me in on the manhunt, which was a bit fascinating.
Yeah, what exactly was your involvement then at that time?
I was teaching a course in criminology at the University of Michigan, and we were spending a lot of time talking about the Ripper, and I was trading theories with this friend of mine who was a member of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, but also a member of the Metropolitan Police, Scotland Yard, which was looking into this case. And I was due to come over to London, and he invited me in on the inquiry and the investigation. It was, I think, to date it may still stand as the world's greatest criminal manhunt before they caught up with this man. But ironically, I'd like to think some of the Holmesian methodology, the Sherlockian approach, was helpful. And it's been said that many police authorities around the world internalized many of Holmes's own methods in these early days of criminology.
Yeah, I'd heard that particularly of the French in their use of fingerprinting and so on.
Exactly, plaster casts, gauging a man's height from his stride, this kind of thing.
Yeah. Let's widen the scope a little bit here. Now, you not only, as a playwright, have created, in a sense, or recreated Arthur Conan Doyle, but you've done Churchill, and you're working on Wyatt Earp, and also doing John Wilkes Booth, or at least the play about that. How Doyle, I guess, in a sense, kind of creating that play has led you into these other arenas?
It is interesting when I look at them. When we first began doing the Doyle project, and then I followed that up with a Churchill play. And then I began thinking, since my childhood, what a fascinating character the old gunfighters were, particularly Wyatt Earp, who lived long enough, through about 1929, to have seen much change. And then just have completed a play about John Wilkes Booth and the Lincoln assassination. All of these characters were within roughly a similar period of time, very roughly. Booth perhaps being the earliest, dying in 1865. But there is something about trying to explore the interior, the psychology, the mechanisms of what makes this person tick. I saw an ad in a library, on a library poster the other day about, they listed Abraham Lincoln, Mark Twain, a number of other famous figures. What do they have in common? And it said they were all mentally ill. Winston Churchill was included among them. What they were meaning was dimensions of what we call mental illness, disturbance, severe bouts of depression, melancholia, what Churchill called his black dog moods. Doyle, it is said, for instance, would go into sort of a funk when he was studying a case. He would close the door and even refuse his meals for maybe a day or two.
Sounds very Sherlockian.
It does. It really does. Wearing his dressing gown, smoking his pipe. And obviously it should, because Sherlock Holmes was no one else really but Arthur Conan Doyle. And this has been a great question that's been asked forever. Of course, as Sherlockians, we play the game that obviously Sherlock Holmes was real, as was Watson. But Watson, Holmes, Moriarty, everyone was Doyle. And it shows you what a multifaceted person this was.
To be able to kind of splinter his personality into so many different actual living characters.
And we find that people capable of this kind of achievement, whether it's a Dickens, whether it's a Poe, they go through a great deal of emotional upheaval. They are not the sanest, most stable individuals in the world. Poe sort of looking over the brink and showing us what he glimpsed.
One thing I was kind of drawing back to Churchill for a moment, Doyle, Wyatt Earp, and so on, while they were still kind of within recent history, as it were, Churchill is certainly the most contemporary, and a lot of people who are alive today would remember him. And he's been parodied so much by comedians and actors and so on. How do you guard against that element that you're falling into a parody of the character?
Well, in Churchill's case, through the makeup, I could look like Churchill. I'm a bit too tall to play Churchill, but we padded me out, and I was sort of in a crouch. Sounding like Churchill is an interesting thing because many people think Churchill sounded like Richard Burton because Burton did some narratives about Churchill's works and things. Churchill, if you did a one-on-one voice, he had a bit of a lisp. The voice didn't sound terribly heroic, but there was an emphasis to his voice. As when I was researching Conan Doyle, we found that there is a film made a year or so before his death in which the man is speaking extemporaneously, but there was a cadence to his voice, and I found that if I could mimic the cadence, the emphasis, that I could deliver the Declaration of Independence attempting to sound as Conan Doyle would have sounded. Doyle did not sound like a caricatured Scotsman. Here was a man of Irish descent, born in Scotland, who spent most of his time in England. So each of those things took its toll. So you try to get into the stereotype and not try to seem just a caricature. You try to give them the sense by saying what the man said. How he said it seems to take a secondary importance.
I know, as you mentioned earlier, Dame Jean hasn't actually seen the performance. Has she heard a recording of you?
Yeah.
What was her reaction?
Well, I have had, as I say, I've spoken with scholars and Doyleans and Sherlockians and people who really are known to know their Doyle, and they have said, this is remarkable, this is incredible, this is uncanny, but the one bit of praise that I would appreciate most was when she first heard the voice and she said, not bad. Now, not bad coming from her was full marks coming from someone else. It is a fascinating thing to literally step into the shoes of a character like that, because I found it is a bit uncanny for me as well. We're built similarly. I have the same sort of flat skull he did, sort of the same dip to the eyes, and with the makeup, the mustache seems to be larger, and he was a very big man, and I remember seeing some tape of one of my performances and seeing it shot from a distance, and I didn't recognize myself. But suddenly I had the impression I was watching Doyle from a distance, which told me something good was happening. It's a thing I'm constantly growing with, and when I was rehearsing the play the first winter, I live along the Lake Erie shore in Michigan, and I was bellowing out one of Doyle's speeches one night. To no one, to the darkness, and I came upon a clearing, and the moon was shining down into this clearing, and it was as close to a vision as you could get because there was a sign that somebody had put in this open clearing, and it said, Doyle Construction Company, allow us to be your major rebuilder. And I told people about that later, and the sign was gone, and some people thought I was lying. And then a year later, when I was about to take the play out again in the springtime, what do you know, the sign was back. This time we got a photograph of it, and they knew I wasn't mad. But it was that odd bit of coincidence that almost was reinforcement. He has become a sort of rebuilder for me.
There seems to be a lot of elements of coincidence, I guess you might say, or that sort of thing throughout your life, connecting you with various people and projects and that kind of thing. Do you feel like there's some sort of a guiding hand that arranges some of these things, or you're just in the right place at the right time?
I'm about to do the play we're going to do here in London on the 23rd of May, and we were lamenting the loss of one of our old Sherlockian friends recently who passed away, and I said I would be co-dedicating the performance in Britain to him. And I said, I have a feeling that night he'll probably be watching it from his vantage point up in the dress circle. I said, what excites me is to think who might be sitting next to him.
Indeed.
You get the feeling that sometimes if you run into the true course of something, you're moving with it instead of against it. And there's a rhythm that I find with Doyle sometimes that I can't explain. I find myself, over a period of a few years, becoming more Doyle-like without attempting to do it. he is more of a comfortable glove for me than, say, to be Churchill. Certain of these characters, like I will not be Wilkes Booth. Someone else will be in my play. But it's a matter of I may be Wyatt Earp. It depends on what you feel comfortable doing. We're not talking Hugh O'Brien. We're talking about the real, the real Earp.
The real Earp, yeah.
And it's a very cathartic thing to be able to step out. And the one-man, one-character genre is a very interesting thing. And people, since Hal Holbrook began doing the Mark Twain thing over 20 years ago, seem more fascinated with spending an evening with this character if they are led to believe this performance is authentic. And so what I sought to do was to refine the performance, starting with the man's daughter and a number of other people. And if I could get their good words, that would allow an audience to hear in an interview circumstance or whatever, that at least what they see will be as close to the truth as maybe has been done to date.
Are there, like in the case of Conan Doyle, any people who were contemporary with Wyatt Earp that you could draw on to find out what he was like?
No film of Earp, but there are certainly photographs. There are a lot of written recollections of the man. But you see, in this sense, it's rather as if people would imagine what Earp might have sounded like. Hal Holbrook said that he actually saw, I think, a bit of film or heard Twain's voice long after he'd been doing the play and was a little reluctant to hear it for fear it would be too different from what he was doing. When he heard it, it was very much like what he was doing, which pleased him no end. People will come with preconceived notions. It reminds me years ago when they made The Greatest Story Ever Told, one of the reviewers said Max von Sydow, the Swedish actor, bore an incredible resemblance to Jesus. Well, we don't have many photographs left
Indeed,
to be able to know.
Strong statement.
It is. In the case of Churchill, they would like to think that he would sound forceful. Doyle and Holmes are two different things because everybody seems to believe they know what Sherlock Holmes looked like, but they're not sure about Doyle. So the best we can do is put a photo of myself in the role next to a photo of Doyle. I can try to woo them that way.
Yeah, indeed. We're just about out of time. I wanted to ask you one quick last question. Out of all of the kind of descriptive terms at the beginning, what would you apply to yourself? What kind of term? Indiana Jones, adventure scholar?
I like the old Victorian term that somebody referred to someone else as a scholar adventurer, which is probably a smart aleck who just likes to go and see things.
Go and see things.
Quester sounds more noble than it is. I like hero best in the classical terms because that means somebody who goes out down into the shadows and decides to come back up and tell what it's like.
Great.
And so the quest is always out there, and it brought me to the Minneapolis area. I thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure discussing things with you today.
Bruce.
Thank you.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.